All right, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack the sobering, strictly data-driven reality of what a third world war would actually look like. We hear the term ww3 thrown around constantly in the news, often just used as a sensational buzzword. But when we strip all that away and look at the hard data from global security analysts, climate scientists, and humanitarian organizations, the picture is incredibly complex and, frankly, chilling. We aren't just talking about armies clashing on some distant battlefield. We're looking at a total systemic shock to human civilization, where the very foundations of civilian survival, our food, our water, our power grids, become the primary casualties. Before we even start to map out the aftermath, we really have to ask ourselves, just how close are we standing to the precipice right now? Well, according to recent risk assessments, the world is currently facing a highly volatile matrix of flashpoints, from high-risk tensions in Eastern Europe and the Taiwan Strait to expanding proxy conflicts in the Middle East. The global risk heat map is literally glowing red. Experts suggest we're already in what they call a pre-conflict alignment phase. That's a period where nations basically stop talking and start quietly positioning their pieces on the board, drawing some pretty unsettling parallels to the years 1937 to 1939, right before the Second World War. To wrap our heads around this incredibly dense topic, we're going to follow a quick roadmap. First, we'll look at the sparks of global conflict. Second, the collapse of critical infrastructure. Third, nuclear winter and survival. Fourth, the laws of war. And finally, balancing necessity and humanity. Okay, let's jump into Section 1, Sparks of Global Conflict and the exact pathways to escalation. History shows us that world wars don't just happen overnight, right? They're the result of a compounding series of failures. The world is currently experiencing several terrifying early warning signs of conflict. We're talking about the collapse of diplomatic channels at the UN, which essentially removes our only diplomatic off-ramp. Pair that with sudden global stock market crashes driven by pure panic, the sudden mobilization of naval fleets, airspace closures, and ICBM tests. When these events start overlapping, deterrence has totally failed, the safety rails are gone, it's a compounding spiral where every defensive move by one country is instantly viewed as an offensive threat by another, locking the globe into inescapable escalation. To put this into perspective, think back to the Cold War. We had a terrifying but relatively straightforward bipolar standoff between the US and the USSR. Today, we are in a multipolar great power competition. Strategic risk reduction is far more volatile now because we have multiple adversarial nuclear powers deeply entangled with one another. If a false alarm goes off today, the decision-making window is incredibly compressed. Leaders would have mere minutes to decide whether to launch a counterattack. The margins for technical or human error are smaller than ever, and a single miscalculation could trigger an irreversible chain reaction. Moving on to Section 2, Collapse of Critical Infrastructure, which is essentially the soft underbelly of our modern civilization. Get this, a staggering 97% of global data runs through just a few hundred highly vulnerable undersea cables. 97%! These cables are the absolute lifeblood of the global information economy, and they're increasingly becoming targets for deniable attacks. You know, those shadowy actions that happen just short of outright war. Whether it's a dragged anchor from a lost commercial ship or intentional military sabotage, severing these lines can blind whole nations in hours. Think about what that actually means for civilian survival. International banking freezes. Supply chains halt entirely. Within days, your local grocery store shelves sit empty, you can no longer use a card to buy food or fuel, and the basic logistics keeping society running just evaporate. And that vulnerability extends all the way up into space. The cascading failure of space warfare is a terrifying domino effect. If satellites are targeted and global GPS systems fail, it doesn't just mean your phone's map stops working. It means global shipping halts entirely, banking synchronization fails, and power grids go dark. Right down at the street level, emergency call centers and ambulances literally lose their ability to respond. A cyber or kinetic attack in the cold vacuum of space directly stops life-saving services here on Earth, leaving populations utterly stranded. Down here on the ground, the physical manifestation of infrastructure collapse brings immediate, devastating consequences for civilians. When heavy explosive weapons hit cities, the destruction is cumulative. You don't just lose an office building, you lose the water treatment facility right next to it. And when clean water stops flowing, waste disposal fails. The resulting humanitarian crisis is horrific. We'd see mass displacement within days, followed by the rapid spread of waterborne infectious diseases like cholera and a complete breakdown of civilian survival systems. It creates an environment completely engineered to extinguish human life. That brings us to Section 3, Nuclear Winter and Survival. This is where we cross a terrifying threshold into the ultimate humanitarian toll. If conventional and cyber warfare escalate beyond the brink, modern climate models paint a genuinely horrifying picture. The immense amount of soot injected into the upper atmosphere from mass detonations and firestorms would completely block out the sun. The data here is stark. The average global temperature would plummet by 7 to 8 degrees Celsius for several years. Now, that might not sound like much, but as a global average, it means inland agricultural areas would freeze entirely. The planet's climate systems would alter overnight, plunging humanity into a literal artificial ice age. And this catastrophic climate shift leads us to perhaps the most lethal secondary effect of all: global food insecurity, or nuclear famine. That sharp drop in temperatures and sunlight would absolutely devastate agricultural areas, crops, and marine fisheries worldwide. So billions of humans who might somehow survive the initial blasts and the radiation would face inevitable starvation. This indirect environmental consequence leaves almost no choice for human survival, making it a far greater threat to our species as a whole than the actual explosions themselves. The sheer scale of mass displacement and ruined environments underscores exactly why the secondary effects of war are so utterly lethal. Humanitarian organizations would be stretched so far beyond any imaginable capacity. First responders would be trying to navigate radioactive fallout and shattered cities to provide relief that simply might not exist anymore. Why? Because the supply chains to bring that relief, the hospitals to administer it, and the roads to transport it have already been heavily targeted and destroyed. The safety nets we rely on every day would simply be gone. Faced with such existential threats, humanity hasn't just thrown up its hands. We've attempted to establish a rulebook. Let's look at Section 4, the Laws of War. This brings us to international humanitarian law, or IHL. You can really think of this as the legal safety net of our civilization. IHL operates on one core assumption: the natural environment, hospitals, and critical infrastructure are civilian in character and must be strictly protected. It's an active, daily attempt to legally balance military necessity, the right of a nation to defeat its enemy, with the absolute, non-negotiable imperative to limit human death and suffering. Finally, Section 5, balancing necessity and humanity. Let's see how this delicate framework actually operates when the stakes are global. One of the absolute cornerstones of this legal balance is the principle of proportionality. Simply put, this means commanders must mathematically and legally weigh their actions. They can't just destroy a city's entire electrical grid because it might slightly inconvenience the enemy. They have to weigh the foreseeable, reverberating civilian harm. If taking out a regional power station means the life support systems at 3 local hospitals fail, that massive civilian harm must be rigorously justified against a highly concrete military advantage. And under international law, it usually cannot be. IHL strictly prohibits treating whole urban populations as legitimate targets. These crucial protections demand that even in a total world war scenario, armies cannot intentionally destroy the very resources that humans need to survive. Starving civilians as a method of combat? Strictly prohibited. You cannot target drinking water installations, agricultural areas, or medical facilities. And even if a hospital is somehow misused for military purposes, IHL requires strict warnings and limits before it ever loses its protected status. The law demands we preserve the foundations of human survival, above all else. But as philosopher Derek Parfit frames here, we are facing the ultimate ethical dilemma of our time. He asks us to compare 3 outcomes: peace, a nuclear war that kills 99% of humanity, and a war that kills 100%. He profoundly reminds us that the leap from 99% to 100% isn't just a 1% difference. It is the total permanent erasure of all future human history. It carries unimaginably heavy moral weight regarding human extinction, showing us that avoiding that final threshold is the ultimate imperative for our species. So, I want to leave you with this final, vital question to ponder. If the laws of war fail, will humanity itself follow? We've seen the data, we've explored the massive vulnerabilities in our global infrastructure, and we've mapped out the catastrophic humanitarian impact of a total escalation. We've also looked at the fragile laws we've built to protect ourselves from our own destructive capabilities. As we consider the true cost of this potential future, it becomes glaringly clear that preventing this outcome through diplomacy isn't just some political strategy. It is quite literally a necessity for the survival of the human species. Thank you so much for joining me in this explainer, and stay curious.